there's a really weird phenomenon in political philosophy which I can't really get and wrap my head around, which is the following. If you ask people in more authoritarian ruled countries, like for example Russia, to take a political stand on an issue, they usually appear to be very depoliticized. So they will come up with answers like, oh, this is too difficult for me to understand. This is way above my pay grade. I trust the authorities that they know what they're doing. I can't really have an opinion on this issue. This is just far too complicated for me to understand. So you have this weird phenomenon of people being depoliticized in relatively more authoritarian countries, while at the same time, in more open societies, in more democratic countries, you see the opposite. You see people when being asked about political issues, usually taking a very, very strong stand, having very, very strong opinions, not even mentioning the issue of complexity, um, taking a stand on issues in which they have absolutely no clue about and have barely any information from social media, and yet they know things. And yet they think they know how institutions are structured, how they think those institutions make decisions, and so on and so on. And the really weird part here is that you have a very asymmetrical situation because in those democratic societies, people would actually have more reason to claim that things are complicated simply because in democratic societies things really are more complicated. The moment you have an open system with relatively open competition, just by nature of how the system is built, there will be more decision points and there will be more things to be taken account of. Just look at any institution that is not strictly hierarchically organized, but more distributed. The moment you have a more distributed system, you have far more nodes that are being involved in making decisions. And the irony here is that even if you have full access to the information of how those institutions are actually structured, and in most cases we actually do, like in Western societies, we know what our academic institutions actually look like. We know who is at the top. We know how they got there. We know their publications. We know what their decisions usually are based on. So you can pretty much track many, many aspects of the processes that are involved. But the overall complexity of the entire system is far greater in authoritarian societies just by definition, because just by definition, authoritarian rule and hierarchical structured um, cultures are more simplistic by default. They work on the notion of simplicity. You have to have a relatively simplistic thread around which people then can self-organize and they can create a relative complexity. But the thread itself, the thread of decision making and of top-down causation, must be there. If it isn't, the society will fall apart. And this is what we have seen in the past actually occurring. In the West, you have a relatively more open system and a relatively more complex system. And the people actually would really have a good reason to say, well, those things indeed are really complicated. And I should really study before I take a position on those issues. And yet people, despite having all the information available at them, don't look at the evidence. They overestimate their own cognition and their own decision-making abilities. They overestimate their own cognitive capacity and take a stand on issues on which they actually can't be prepared to have a position. If you haven't even really prepared for, say, a weekend seminar to know like what are the basic institutions that are involved, to look at any of the evidence of like how are those institutions structured, you can't really have an opinion on those issues. But again, the really funny part is that in societies in which people could actually understand what's going on, where the complexity is not overburdening, simply because the system in authoritarian systems, the system is built in a way that it can't and it shouldn't ever become overly complex. Otherwise, it would run out of control. People couldn't be in charge of it. So it has to have a limitation on complexity. And again, the irony here is that in those systems where people could actually have an opinion on issues, people don't want to have an opinion on issues. And they feel like, oh, it's too complicated for me. And while on the other hand, in relatively open systems, which are relatively more complicated and where decision making is complicated by the fact that you have too many agents who have different interests and who parse the reality they're surrounded by in different ways, people are coming up with solid positions and statements about what is and what isn't without even having looked at the reality of things with a certitude that is really sometimes very, very astonishing. And I think if we don't understand this trend, if we don't understand what is behind this, because it's counterintuitive. You would think people in a more complex society would be aware of the complexity and will be more cautious when making claims about how things are actually coming together. If we don't understand how this dynamics is coming together, I think open societies are definitely in a competitive disadvantage here, right? They are definitely running the danger of being beaten and losing in direct competition with systems that are actually more hierarchically structured and more, in a way, simple and simplistic, and yet more punchy, more powerful, more consolidated, and more coherent. We were like running the danger of paying a price with too much differentiation by losing coherence and thus losing integration. So when you lose coherence, you basically you dissolve, you fragment into different subgroups and subsystems, which have a relative coherence. This is what usually tends to be the case. And I think this tendency is definitely observable in the West, in general speaking, and in the vacuum of that is being created here. I think agents who come up with simplistic solutions definitely have a competitive advantage, and it's very likely to see what Vlad Wexler has been saying in the next few decades. More and more authoritarian rule take over those systems and run those systems because they just can't. They can't maintain cohesion. When you have a social system where the different participants in it can't even talk to each other anymore, don't understand each other anymore, speak different languages, have entirely different sets of rules as to how to behave and what to find funny, to find inspiring, what to find valuable. In such a situation, I believe social systems will either totally disperse and be eaten by stronger competitors, or they will form around new authoritarian rule that pushes the complexity down to a level um, that creates coherence enough for those systems to basically stick together. This seems to be a trend that I think needs to be understood before any other step is being making in whatever kind of direction in Western societies. And this trend is there, and I think it's pretty obvious.